Well, I'm going to immediately break the rules, if that's okay, by suggesting you can ask me questions in the middle of my presentation, simply because I think I might be talking about something that might be a bit obscure and complicated, and feel free to ask me clarification questions. I'm going to try and carry on from the, maybe just one thing about me. I'm a sort of an artist, designer, and academic now. So I'm going to be talking about smart city type stuff from a designer perspective, and how we might sensitize designers to think differently about where they're located and what they might be designing. So I'm kind of carrying on from the last discussion, from the last kind of part of this kind of thing, which was asking about where the political is and how we might think about the political. So I'm thinking about how we might design meaningful and political data. So that's maybe a little bit controversial because I'm suggesting that data is designed. So I'm going to be talking about metrics. I'm going to be talking about some data controversies. So I'm going to be talking specifically about Heathrow Airport. And I'm going to show some of my designs, not because they're exciting exemplars of brilliant design, but maybe because they illustrate a design approach for how designers can really get involved in controversies that are about people's sensations, their feelings, but also controversies about data. And I think it's a very relevant thing to think about how smart city technologies might be transforming these kind of classic controversies, such as noise at airports. So I'm going to talk about Heathrow, but I think this is equally applicable to Schiphol, where I know there's very similar kind of tensions, for example. So yeah, I'm already going to answer my question, how do we do it? And I'm suggesting we design within controversies. And I'm going to focus a little bit on this kind of rather clumsy word, within. And I'll try and show you what I mean by within. So the kind of question to ask maybe is, where are we when we design? And what I mean by that, I actually paid for this kind of clip art image of a smart city thing because I found it interesting to see where people are getting hold of these smart city images. Anyway, the point is, where are we located in this? And we are located in your hand, but we're also located nowhere. But if we follow that plane along, we can get to somewhere real, I think. So this is Heathrow Airport. And I'm suggesting there's different ways of designing for Heathrow Airport. And if we kind of locate ourselves here, which is the control tower at Heathrow Airport, which looks like this, it looks like very much like that, in that the plane is at the center and you have a network around the plane. It's all about logistics of bags and planes moving around and various other kind of networky, logistics-y type things. And these are kind of the classic, maybe, approaches that designers might engage with an airport like this. But I'm suggesting there might be another kind of space for designers to think about these kind of contexts. So if we just shift a little bit north of the runways here, this little village at the top there is called Sipson. And the thing about Sipson is that it's one of the places that's probably going to be destroyed when a third runway is going to be built. So it's precisely underneath the new terminal there. So this is the discussion in the moment in England, in the UK, about should the third runway be built at Heathrow. And what you get is you get this kind of thing, no, and you get this thing, yes. And the thing about it is very much this controversy. This is what I call a controversy. It's very much communicated as a debate, right? Some people are holding up signs saying no, some people are holding up signs saying yes, and the politicians are calling it a toxic dilemma, in the sense that they don't know where to go with this, because they have to deal with it as a trade-off, right? There's commercial interests, and they know that expanding the airport will cause an increase in pollution. So the whole way it's being framed is as a debate, people having opinions. Now, I'm suggesting that's not a very productive space for us as designers or people to engage with. And I think if we actually locate ourselves somewhere specific again, which is at the little arrow, there's a little cricket shed there. If we actually locate ourselves in that cricket shed there in Sipson, we actually find these people. And these people are actually experts on the issue itself. In fact, they're actually people who've been involved in this for the last 10, 20 years with noise at Heathrow. And what's interesting is the kind of documents they use. So this is a photograph from that particular workshop I was running. And they have these kind of academic papers that they download themselves, which talk about disturbance and annoyance. And annoyance is something I want to focus on because it's something that we know. Annoyance is a kind of normal word that we're familiar with, but it has a very particular technical meaning. And I'm going to talk about annoyance metrics because I think they give us a new way of thinking about where design can enter into these discussions. So just to kind of go back a little bit, the first kind of approach, which is the classic designer approach, is kind of thinking of it in terms of hard infrastructure, right? Runways, aeroplanes, logistics, and there's kind of political debates, the controversy, which is yes, no, politicians, activists, and companies, which is not a space of design. But if we really locate ourselves inside the controversy, I'm suggesting we can find some relational infrastructure, which really is a thing that mediates, where technologies and metrics mediate between airport residents and authorities. So some of the kind of discussions we had this morning, I think they become very concrete. They're not just kind of lines on a diagram, kind of arrows pointing between things. I think these are actually technologies themselves, and these are technologies that need to be designed. And what's interesting is that the current technologies we have, at least in Heathrow, they're from 1982. So there's some really interesting potential here for design, I would say. So I'm going to try and take you a little bit into the metric itself, and this is where it gets a little bit complicated and technical, and you might not understand, so please shout out if it gets a bit weird. So those two black lines are the two runways of Heathrow. You see those there? Yeah? The bigger kind of purple contour is the old annoyance contour from 1974. And the smaller one is the one from 2011. So this is one of the, figure 4.4. This is from a report from the airport that they published. What they're trying to demonstrate is that the contour of annoyance is reducing over time. What that means is that the people who live there, less people are being affected by the airport. This is the key thing. And this is actually the key thing that dictates whether the third runway will be built, if they can demonstrate that less people are being affected by the noise of the airport. So what is annoyance? What does that mean? And what's fascinating about it, it's incredibly simple. So in 1982, researchers went to 2,097 houses and asked people a single question. Well, they asked them a lot of dummy questions, and they asked them one key question, which is, please look at the scale and tell me how much the noise from aircraft here bothers or annoys you. Very much, moderately, a little, or not at all. So the whole of that amazing contour that dictates the legislation around the airport is based on this single question asked in 1982 of just over 2,000 people. And what happens is that the way it was done is that you basically have the very much annoyed is over here, and you have the decibel, so they were doing measurements where they were doing the interviews, and it gives you a line or a curve. It used to be called the Schultz curve. That was the kind of classic thing. So that's what annoyance really is. And what they do is they take a particular level, so the 57, which is this magic number, is just up here, and it's for about 20% of people being very much annoyed by noise at that particular level. So there's this arcane kind of social science surveys that were done in the 1982, which are still dictating the way annoyance and the legislation works. So that's how we get this kind of contour. Now, the fascinating bit is how that becomes a metric, right? So if we look at this, so these are some of the years here, and it shows you the important bit is this one, again, the purple one at the top there. So there's about 250,000 people being affected by noise, and it's not varying very much. So if that went up a lot in proposals, they would not be able to build the third runway. So that indicator is the key legislative indicator. So what's fascinating when you actually talk to residents about this, they're somewhat unhappy, as you can imagine. They say things like, Heathrow are exploiting the 57 dB noise threshold to make it look like it's a reduction of noise with an expanded airport. The reality, of course, is that noise continues to be hugely disturbing to many people, considerably below the threshold, me included. Where I currently live, well, it's better than Kew, which is a place. Just outside the contour is still disturbing enough to wake my children regularly. So what you find is that people classify themselves whether they're in contour or out of contour. This is a really big decision point because the people who are in contour, they get basically financial support for insulation, or if you live very close to the airport, you actually get your house subsidized by the airport. Whereas if you're out of contour, you're essentially seen to be not affected by noise. So this is something that's actually a big point of annoyance for people, as you can imagine, itself. Okay? And people say things like, people cannot believe what they're being told by the airport. People have gotten no data or system that they can rely on because the system is actually produced by operators who want to produce a view of the world to sanitize some of the issues. Okay? So they're asking for a different kind of system. So there's a huge amount of metrics that have been discussed. So this is actually a space of innovation, if you like, using this kind of term that we've had this morning a little bit, innovation. And surprisingly, the people who are innovating are not the kind of people in this room. They're acousticians and people who live in the local area. And I think this is a space for lots of people to innovate. And I don't know if you're familiar with this image. I'd like to kind of suggest that the metric is actually a kind of leviathan. It's actually made up of lots of people. So there's an image that was made by Hobbes of kind of Charles I, if I remember, and it was supposed to represent the authority of the king, which is composed of many, many bodies, many entities, and the king gets to speak on behalf of the mass, the population. And I'm suggesting the metric is a little bit like this. It's a spokesperson that gets to speak on behalf of these people who are somehow embedded in this, whether they like it or not. So the question is, how do they deal with this kind of leviathan figure that's kind of basically speaking on their behalf? And what's interesting when you talk to acousticians about this, they are suggesting we need to deal with self-reported complaints. And they say in the 70s it was difficult. It was difficult to process systematically, compare, largely inaccessible, generally awkward to interpret. But they're saying new technologies for self-reporting complaints might bring something exciting. And these are acousticians who do not build these gizmos, right? But I bet there's some people here who can build gizmos that do interesting things, okay? So here's a kind of weird design space that doesn't seem to exist on many people's register. I'm just going to give you some of my examples of how I dealt with it. And these are just little provocations. And, you know, I'm a PhD student in the moment, so this is not sponsored by Cisco or anything, but I wonder if there were a larger group of designers, if there was whole studios, if there was whole courses that were designing this kind of thing. I wonder if we really actively targeted metrics, if we could move somewhere interesting with this. So just to show you, this was in a workshop. I was designing these kind of objects. These were kind of provocation objects, but they were also tangible objects that worked. Okay? So as I kind of told you, this kind of spokesperson, this Leviathan, here's a technology that's also speaking on your behalf. This thing was basically changing and has a microphone. And as a plane was flying over the workshop we were talking, this thing would be reacting, would be speaking on people's behalf. But it wouldn't, instead of numbers, it would be saying things like painful. And what was interesting is that it kind of triggered this kind of discussion that actually, you know, the metrics are not accounting for their experience properly. And people talked about there needed to be different ways of accounting for it. And it ended up being a discussion about, do we need subjectivity? Do we need objectivity? But what was fascinating about it is that the argument at the end was, take it all. Because the people who were there, they were interested in a political campaign. They don't want to differentiate between particular methodologies or particular ontologies or how we're supposed to talk about noise. They wanted to have a political program which meant adopting a range of different ways of representing noise, sound, their experience. So I think that is kind of fascinating, is how you can actually, if you have a particular engagement with a particular controversy, if you are located within it, you can actually deal with very different ways of understanding a particular thing itself. And I mean, for me, this is what that particular object did. And, you know, these things are as much for me as they are for the people I'm working with. I mean, they didn't know what to do with this. And it is a rhetorical kind of device, right? This was another kind of rhetorical device, if you like, but could be practical. It was designed to go on people's houses, on the outside of their houses. And the idea was that it might almost communicate to their neighbors. So as a plane would be flying over, these things would be flashing, indicating this. So I had this kind of vision that you might be on the plane, and as you're flying over this area, suddenly you see all of the ground lighting up, seeing the effect you're having on the local area. But also the neighbors would suddenly kind of might take some position on it. Fascinatingly, people hated it. Okay, that was brilliant. I mean, for me, it was an amazing insight because, of course, what it does, it means it demonstrates that there's a problem. So people were concerned, A, what effect it might have on house prices, because you're demonstrating that your area is affected, but also they started talking about the fact that schools in the area, for example, are having to choose whether they're prepared to oppose the airport or not, because they get funding from the airport. So actually, it's a very difficult position to be seen to be speaking, and there's a massive control situation about people being radical and speaking about this, which is very much on an insular way. People are allowed to make complaints on a one-to-one or one-to-computer system way, but they're not allowed to do things in public space. So because this was a proposal for public space, it was really a complicated, difficult proposal. So for me, that was fascinating to see, right? So if you like, from a research perspective, it was really interesting to see this thing that I saw some people nodding that this might be a really good idea, that people said no. And I think that's really interesting, not just because they were rejecting it, but because it gives you an insight on how designers can be very wrong if they're not located in the controversy, okay? Just another small proposal. So this is a thing. So we were in this workshop, doing this workshop, and there were planes flying over all the time. So every time a plane flew over, this thing was basically sending an SMS message to my phone. So I was getting these kind of alerts, basically, like Isleworth 94 dBA peak. And I showed them the source code of my little device that I'd built, and I said, imagine you could put somebody else's mobile phone number in there. And then there was a little bit of a pause, and then suddenly people all started laughing as they started realizing the potential of this, because they could start making somebody personally responsible for the noise. And I think that's one of the key frustrations that people have, right? There isn't anybody personally responsible. It's seen to be this systemic thing where they're supposed to go through these complicated processes, whereas this was a kind of shortcutting of some of this nice system, right? But what was also fascinating, it was very difficult to decide whose mobile phone number goes in there. And some people actually didn't want it to be so personal because that becomes quite political. And shouldn't it go to Twitter instead because Twitter is so much more public and so much more nice and accessible? But it's a very different kind of project. So what this device actually became, it became a discussion about what kind of approach did that group of people want to have towards the airport? Were they activists? Were they NIMBYs? Who were they? Were they just residents? How did they want to define themselves? And these were people who didn't know each other before and who actually, by the end of the workshop, decided that they were a group who wanted to go forward and do something. And I think it happened through these kind of devices that made them take a position on their own strategy. And so a tiny little simple prototype that I built within a weekend can start, if you're located in a particular controversy, you can start creating these things that force location, that force people to take position, forced me to take position, forced them to take position. In the end, nobody wanted to borrow this device, which was also interesting. This is the one that everybody wanted to borrow. I turn noise into numbers. So I kind of gave them these kind of slightly provocative titles because I think they're useful for me to be clear about what is I'm trying to provoke people into, but also for people to have a relationship towards what I'm trying to say with it. So it's almost the device is speaking, right? This is what the device would be trying to do. So this is a very basic kind of thing, that a noise monitor, right? It literally gives you graphs. It gives you, let me see, have I got it? Yeah. So this is what people want to see, right? They want to see peaks, and each one is a plane. So at the end of the workshop, this is the one that everybody wanted to take home. And in fact, it was installed at somebody's house for a few months. Now, the problem with it is that it's not calibrated, it's not super great. And I found it was kind of frustrating because it didn't trigger any discussion. And it didn't take you very far. It was basically reproducing the same model of the kind of commercial noise monitors. It was going to be cheaper, we could have lots of them, but I think it didn't take it far enough. So what happened is we actually developed something a bit better, which was calibrated. It's still incredibly cheap. The cost of one of these is about £100. But this is the equivalent to somewhere in between a class 2 and a class 1 measurement device. So it speaks a kind of accuracy, legitimacy, but it also does something else. I call it, I quantify and I broadcast. Because there was something about these different ways of wanting to represent noise that people talked about with the other device that I wanted to bring into this device. So this device has two things. It has two ontologies. I use this weird word, ontologies. It speaks two different languages of noise. One, the kind of language of number graphs, but also another one of experiencing sound. So here is one of those installed. Maybe I can just play this. Let's see. Can you hear anything? I can't hear anything. Ah, now we can. What's that? Yeah, I've got a little timer thingy here. I really wanted to play this to you live because it is a live thing. This is actually running right now. If you want to have a look at softhook.com/Heathrow, you can listen to the live streams where you can basically look at the data in real time and you can listen to this. And what listening to it does something very different. You don't just hear planes, you hear birds, you hear other kind of entities. And what was fascinating for me is that you actually hear the effect of the planes on the birds, for example. So the birds are actually they're impacted by this noise. So by dealing with sound itself, I actually had ornithologists being interested because they wanted to do automatic extraction of identifying the particular plane effects on birds. So they wanted to identify the particular species being affected. I had noise artists getting involved in this project. So this is actually, instead of this just being a gizmo, it's actually become a network of about 6 or 7 developers who are all working together on this with different understandings of sound and noise and the Heathrow issue. So there's some people who are simply using this to do sound installations, whereas other people are interested in the data. So, sorry, I'll just go back to my gizmo. Here's another installation. So one of the people who I installed this at, he was actually a retired guy from IBM, and he is very good with visualization. So this is his visualization, and he's developing a new metric. This is the important thing. So he's trying to develop an alternative metric for Heathrow, which is not about modeled noise, which all the annoyance stuff, it's actually modeled. There's very little actual empirical measurement. So what he's actually developing is two different things. The thing at the top, it allows him to identify illegal flights. So he's actually particularly focused on helicopters that fly low over his house. So these are individual complaints. So he's actually using the data to make individual complaints about flights or helicopters. But he's also developing long-term metrics where, for example, this is from January until April data, and he's basically looking to answer the question, is Heathrow getting noisier or quieter? So he's developing real long-term metrics that speak about the operations of the airport through his own house, which I think is a really powerful argument to make, is that you can really demonstrate, no matter of these other kind of graphs, at my house, this airport is getting louder or not, or quieter. And he's getting very, very detailed. He can start looking at, is the Easter holiday, what effect does that have? And these are the kind of things that are not being developed. These are not being kept by the airport. So he's developing new metrics, and he's actually using them with the local councils that are starting to take this very seriously. So this is just one guy who's using this. What's going to be interesting, once we have a network of these all surrounding the airport, it doesn't take very much until we have more devices that are as calibrated as the airport that actually speak lots of different languages, get lots of people involved, and start having some real political purchase. This is one of the sound installations where you get both the graph and the sound. So these are sort of my little conclusions, if you like. So for me, data becomes meaningful when it's within a controversy. So this is where the within comes from. It's about being located as the designer, but also there's kind of particular points within a controversy that need to be designed. So this is where I'm talking about these metrics, which is this often hidden, kind of complicated stuff that's hard to get at, and I think hard for us to see as a space of design. But I think so the point 3, if we start approaching them, they start becoming a new space for us to kind of create design within. And as we can see, I gave you a very small example, but there's a massive opportunity for people to unlock more of these kind of controversies, these classic old controversies that have been around ever since planes started to be noisy or cars started to be noisy, or we've had any kind of pollution or any kind of social problems. They are all mediated by metrics. there's a massive opportunity for us to really get involved as a larger public, if you like, in designing these kind of things. So I think these new approaches have a lot of potential to unlock these classic these classic problems. And maybe the fourth one, maybe the one that's important for me, is that by being kind of involved as a designer within the controversy, you become personally affected, right? I mean, I care about this place. I've been working on this now for more than 3 years. I become very sensitized to the planes that come over my own house, and I spent a lot of time talking with these people. I'm now in a longer-term network. It's not just me doing this. Yeah, so I'm almost finished. And by becoming personally affected, I think we can design devices that also allow other people to become affected. Because I think if we're not affected as designers ourselves, I think we can't design things that kind of get other people affected in this way. So I really think this is a key crux, and it doesn't matter whether you're interested in airports or not, or metrics or not. I think this idea of being within something, positioning yourself as a designer, I think is very key. And in my opinion, at least, it cuts through some of the larger, well, I mean, this is an argument. I think that there's a lot of problems with the smart city rhetorics, funding problems, all these kind of things. But I think even if you're within these kind of institutional networks, by being personally affected, I think you can cause change at whatever level, even if it's just personal kind of confrontation, personal positioning yourself differently. And I think I just invite people to get personally involved in these things. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Would anyone like to ask Christian anything? Christian, I had one question for you. Fascinating talk. On the one hand, we were talking just now at the end of our previous session about using our voice. Technology gives us all sorts of new ways to use our voices. At the same time, a lot of us are afraid or not eager to use our voices. So there's a tortured relationship between technology and democracy.
I don't think so. Hello? Can I be back on? Oh, yeah. I don't think there is a tortured relationship between democracy and technology. I think technologies are around us and have ever been. I mean, I think democracy is a kind of technology. I mean, all the kind of institutional models we use for what we call democracy are kind of technologies. I mean, ballots, any kind of these things are kind of technologies of organizing things. I would also argue that voice is the wrong model to use. I mean, I think the model of data is starting to replace voice, whether we like it or not. And I just think referring back to these kind of data practices as giving us a voice, I think is somehow maybe not the right way of looking at the particularities of what these data practices do personally. I think they do different things that kind of change things in slightly different ways. And I think they don't. What I'm saying is democracy is changing through these practices. It's not the same democracy that we had 50 years ago or 100 years ago. So these kind of technologies are within what we call the democratic.
But this gentleman who has been keeping track of the noise levels, say, since January, and will continue to do so for a long time, I assume, that's a way of using your voice to produce objective data which the airport would probably not produce on its own, or would intimidate people by cutting their subsidies if they dared to protest. So wouldn't you call that using your voice?
I think it's not his voice. And I think the interesting thing is that he is totally, and the point I was trying to get at with the kind of spokesperson, the Leviathan image, is that it's not about people's voices. I mean, things like the annoyance metrics are totally designed to eliminate people's voices, right? So the whole idea of the device that kind of produces this data is also a way of stepping outside of the idea of the person complaining, because the person complaining has no legitimacy within the political process, okay? So this is a good example of where voice is just the wrong metaphor to use, in my opinion.
Because it's all about the objectivity.
It's about data practices. I mean, it's not even about objectivity. I think data is certainly not objective. It's designed, but I think it becomes political. So anyway, I'll stop ranting. I'm sorry. But I think it's a really important thing that maybe we need to
Yeah.
open up to.
Great. Thank you, Christian Nold. I'll come to you. Hang on. Could you stand up?
I'm getting a little bit confused because you showed the provocative design you made for the, I don't know what you would call it, the system on the wall, the outside wall of the house, and you said they decidedly didn't want a kind of machinery like that because that would create discussion. And I understood that you said that you were a little bit disappointed because they chose the method that didn't provoke discussion.
Discussion is politically disabled. Public displays are disabled by the controversy in that area. So this is a kind of, if you like, a private network. So what's interesting, this is an attempt to try and develop almost a private data network where people don't need to be identified, they don't need to have a voice, they don't have to be John that's speaking and gets up to kind of complain. They don't have to make themselves identifiable. So as a designer, I misunderstood the possibility of public space with that prototype. There is no possibility for public space. It is so heavily policed within that context that I think for design interventions, public space is a non-area within Heathrow. That's the point I was trying to make.
Yes. Hang on, Dietmar. We'll get there. I'll get to you. Yes, first. Go ahead. Stand up, please.
Yes, I just wanted to remark that you might see the technologies as a sensing device rather than speaking voice device, because you can sense in a much different way. It's like having an additional organ for sensing.
Extra ears.
Yes, that you didn't have before. And that can then be turned into the voice that you use because you have a much stronger data claim from which you talk, either about silence or about noise.
Yep. One last question, Christian.
Hello, it's James Stewart from Edinburgh. That was really interesting. We've been working a lot with this idea, and we run courses teaching design students to develop new metrics and explore the kind of sociology of it. But after talking a lot about data, we shifted to think about evidence and evidence practices and how digital data is one of the types of evidence that we can bring in, scientific evidence, but also emotional storytelling sort of evidence. And each one is appropriate in a different type of situation. So you're saying in Heathrow, you've closed down the public arena. So you've had to find what are the other places where you have to take evidence and what's the form? What are the practices? When, who, how, what does it have to look like? Is it better to have numbers or is it better to have stories or pictures or whatever in that practice? And now the citizen science type thing has given us a whole lot of new ways for all sorts of people to bring new types of evidence, often in the scientific form. And one of the challenges is how they can be knocked back by other experts unless you're really careful. So this thing about calibration, I think that's a really interesting issue about, you might say a little bit more about when it comes right down to the quality of that evidence and how's that defended in these different arenas.
Final words, Christian? Oh, I thought you were going to. I thought you were going to respond.
I mean, it's all good. I mean, I really think those kind of controversies should be spaces for design in lots of different ways. I mean, we just need all that. I mean, we need people to do stories. We need people to do all sorts of things. Great, yeah. And I think it'll become politically difficult when people try and dismiss stories and try and dismiss data. And I think there's some interesting conflations. I mean, I think when we bring them together, or when one starts to look a bit like the other, I think it starts becoming interesting. When data becomes storyfied or stories become datafied, it's sort of interesting muddles that can be done in those spaces. So I think it's a great design challenge, I would say. And I think those are the places we should be targeting rather than the street. I mean, I think the street is always this classic fantasy place that we should be targeting. I think we should be dealing with real problem areas. Anyway.